everyone, and welcome to today's EDF webinar, The Clean Energy Future is Near Call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, you will have the opportunity to ask questions during the question and answer session. You may register to ask a question at any time by pressing the star and 1 on your touch-tone phone. You may withdraw yourself from the queue by pressing the pound key. Please note this call may be recorded. I will be standing by if you should need any assistance. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Mr. Andy Darrell.
Thank you all and welcome. It's really fun to have so many people both here in the room and also online and on the phone. So this is sort of a new format for us. We'll be interacting, all of us, during the conversation and Q&A section, and I'm really hoping we'll have a chance to have a good dialogue. Folks on the line, I think, are from all over the country, and of course most of the folks here in New York are from this region. Anyway, I'm Andy Darrell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the regional director for EDF here in New York, and I'm also chief of strategy for our energy work. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to have this conversation about how EDF, both our staff and all of you, all of us together, are going to help accomplish what I think is one of the most important things that can happen for the future of our planet and our society, and that's a transition to clean energy. But before I start, I just want to remind folks of a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are on the phone or online, if you need to reach an operator, for those of you on the phone, if you need to reach an operator during the call, just hit the star key followed by 0. If you want to get in line to ask a question, you hit the star key and then 1. And of course, if you're here in the room, if you want to ask a question, you raise your hand and ask a question. And of course, those of you online can also ask questions by typing them into the dialog box on the screen. And we have a person here in the room who will be reading those, and we'll sort of be taking turns on questions between folks on the phone and the web and here in the room. And just for quick format, we're going to talk, my colleague Cheryl and I are going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to conversation. And if you have a burning question that you want to interrupt us and ask a question, don't be shy, please do it. But that's generally the format, and hopefully there'll be a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end. For sure. Well, so before we start, I just want to share this picture with you, because for me, this picture captures sort of the essence of the challenge and the opportunity that lies ahead of us for clean energy. The parts of the world that are lit up here, these are the parts of the world that have electrified, that have grown, that have become prosperous through the use of electricity. They're also the parts of the world that have largely put a lot of the pollution up into the air and up into the atmosphere that is causing climate change today. And of course, there are lots of parts of the world where there isn't electricity yet, or not as much electricity as folks might like. So part of the challenge here, if we're going to solve climate change, is to figure out how are we going to help these parts of the world that have the lights on today cut the pollution that the energy system is creating, and then how do we create the business models and the technology models to help make it possible for the parts of the world that would like to have the lights on more, do that in a way that is not going to make climate change worse. And that's sort of fundamentally our challenge. And I think if you look at the sort of EDF strategic plan, the big broad brush movements there really are two fundamentally sort of copacetic approaches. Right? One approach is what I think of as making the bad stuff more expensive, making the polluting stuff more expensive. And that articulates itself, you hear that a lot, people talking about a carbon price, a carbon market, a carbon cap, right? Pollution standards on power plants. In other words, how do we internalize that cost? If you're an economist, you think about it, how do you internalize the cost of the pollution that fossil fuel burning fundamentally is creating? So that is a very important piece of how do you transform the market, and that is putting that price on carbon. The other side of that, sort of the the flip side of that is how do you make the good stuff more accessible and less expensive? And you really need to do those two things together, right? You want solar panels, wind, geothermal, energy efficiency, all these great things to be technologies that almost anybody can use almost anywhere. And so there's a lot that we can do, and this is really the topic of the conversation today, is going to be a bit less about what's going on to make the bad stuff more expensive, and a lot more about what are we going to do to make the good stuff, the solar, the wind, the clean energy, the efficiency, more accessible and less expensive for businesses and homes and cities and countries to access. So with that basic frame, I want to introduce you now to Cheryl Roberto, who is EDF's Vice President for Clean Energy. She comes to us relatively recently with a background that makes her really perfect to lead EDF's efforts in the United States to accomplish this transition to cleaner energy. She was a regulator in Ohio, so she knows how utilities work. She understands the rules of the game. She gets the issues from the business and the government point of view. And we're really lucky to have her here with us to help lead our efforts. So Cheryl, with that, welcome.
Thank you. Nice introduction, Andy. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. This is one of my favorite things to do, to share information about our programs with people who are passionate about it, as I am. The challenge, the context for our conversation today is that we have a challenge and an opportunity with the greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. 80% of those emissions come from carbon dioxide, and of those CO2 emissions, fully 40% of them come from the electricity sector. So this is just to give you a context for the challenge, which also represents an opportunity for us. Now I want to lead with the good news. This is entirely within our abilities. This is not a technological barrier. For the first time in decades, the clean energy future is very, very real. We've had a study come out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratories, and it has documented that with commercially available technology, what we know about today, 80% of our needs could be met any time of the day, any place on our grid domestically, if we make sure we have the flexible electric system that we need. That's the opportunity that we see, and that's what we're working on. The clean energy economy is not just technologically feasible, it's actually affordable. The cost curve that you're looking at, it's sort of a yellow goldenrod that's driving downward. That's solar. I mean, take a look at the curve on that solar. Solar prices are falling so quickly that they're outpacing even what the analysts expect them to do. Another trend that's really significant to this effort is that we are breaking the link between economic health and the use of electricity. For the past century, they've been synonymous. When we electrified the country, when we got more GDP, we drove more and more electricity across the power lines, we electrified the nation. Those traveled together. We used more power to become wealthier as a nation. That line is now divided, and we are now learning to do more with less while we still deliver the GDP. So comparing those trends with some important facts, what we see is that there's a momentum building for a clean energy future. That first block that takes us up a step are aging power plants. In the United States, our generation facilities are on average more than 30 years old, but if we look at the coal-fired fleet, it's really about 42 years old. And the cost, the cost to rebuild and maintain those fleets are massive, and we don't want to do that. That would be like paving the cow path. What we now know is that those fleets don't meet our needs. As we've seen recently from events like Superstorm Sandy, we have a need for power that's enormous. On an annual basis, we see $79 billion in loss economically across the country from interruptions to our power supply. And you might think that's all because of hurricanes and superstorms, but really fully 2/3 of that is for the digital economy that now suffers economic loss when we see just little blips, momentary outages. Technological advances. Every one of you probably has an iPhone in your pocket. You have opportunity to bank online. We use big data and telecommunication structure. Information is available to us that is really upgrading the services we receive from nearly every industry except for electricity. We haven't taken advantage of that, but we're beginning to. The stronger clean air standards. The coal-fired plants are also facing an obligation to pull the toxic mercury out of their smokestacks. And that's going to require additional investment, which makes them increasingly uneconomic. We've talked about falling energy costs. We've talked about energy efficiency. The other truly trend-setting event factor on the horizon is something we've fully experienced for about the last 5 to 8 years, is the increase in hydraulic fracturing and the advances in shale gas. What we're seeing now is the coal-fired plants can no longer economically compete against the natural gas-fired plants. If you stack up all of these building blocks, what you see is that we're getting to a tipping point. It's starting to happen, but it's not happening fast enough. And without EDF and our partners' intervention, we could very well backslide. And an example that I can share with you is from my own home state of Ohio. This illustrates the transition that we're seeing, but let me tell you a little bit about what's happening in Ohio, or what has attempted to happen, but we were successful in rolling back. AEP is an electric utility in Ohio. They have coal plants. They're no longer economic for all those reasons that I shared with you. Rather than shutter them and embrace a clean energy future, they went to their regulators, the state regulators in Ohio, and they asked to impose a fee on all users of the system to support a subsidy for those coal-fired plants. That fee would have been levied on every user, including users who had made the choice to invest only in clean energy for their own needs. Because EDF got involved with a number of our partners, we were able to reverse that. The Public Utilities Commission last week announced that it would not accept that. That's very good news because shortly on their heels, First Energy tried the same thing. They're using hyperbolic language around reliability concerns and their concern for customers that this will provide more or less volatile pricing, more reliable pricing. And that's simply not the case. We're fighting it every step of the way. But without these types of interventions, we will see momentum reversed. And it's this need that we're engaging in to move it ahead. So the barriers that exist are not technological. That's the good news. They're barriers that we actually know how to address. Barriers like the regulatory complexity. We have state regulation. We have federal regulation. We have an outdated business model. Political. We have gridlock at the national level. You're fully aware of it. State houses, it's difficult as well. The work we're proposing to do is actually inside of those regulatory commissions. That's where we're working. Structural. We don't know how to make all this work. It takes practice. It takes case studies. That's what we're advancing, things like our Pecan Street project. Financial. Some of these, while on the long-term solutions, are much cheaper. There are higher upfront costs, and we need to bring private capital in to help bear that and transition us through them. So our plan is 4 parts. We can address all of those challenges that we just talked about by addressing what we call Utility 2.0. That means we need to move to a new business model. Grid modernization. It means that our grid needs to be nimble and accept the fact that power isn't going to come from one source and be pushed out to all of us. It's going to be a two-way system where some of us generate power, some of us respond to signals to help balance the grid. Proper valuation, we're making certain that clean energy is fully valued for all the attributes that it brings to the grid and grid stability. And finally, finance. We know that unleashing private capital that's sitting on the sidelines, is a critical part of our success, and we've got strategies to do that as well. So this guy, Thomas Edison, if he saw the grid right now, he completely recognized it. And the reason he would recognize it is because we're still operating under the regulatory structure we started then. A century ago, when our economy, our public health, required us to have electrification across the nation, we did it by imposing a regulatory structure on a monopoly, granting a franchise that rewarded these monopolies for expanding their infrastructure and selling more electricity. That's not the model that's going to bring us into the 21st century. So to assure that clean energy future, the heart of our work is to reform utility regulations to match our needs today. We're going to eliminate rules designed to incent expansion of infrastructure and more electricity, and we're going to replace it with incentives for delivering energy services which have high quality, reliability, affordability, and they're clean. We're focusing our efforts on 9 states. The reason we chose these 9 states is that fully 50% of the customers and 50% of the CO2 is generated in these 9 states. They also are home to a number of multiple state utilities. So if we get a win in one state, it can be replicated through additional states more easily. Because of our work, we will be growing the economy, giving people control over their energy use, and we'll be slashing harmful pollution. So possible with this strategy, what we expect to see is that by 2018, we will be locking in, because of changes in the policies that we're advocating, up to a 13% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions from our electricity sector from 2005. So we're very excited about it. Among those 9 states is New York, which is where we're sitting now, and I'd like Andy to just share with you a little bit more as an example of what we're doing inside of one of those states.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl. As Cheryl mentioned, in the United States, we're focused on 9 states, and those states cover half the U.S. electricity market. And you can imagine that the politics and the challenges are very different in each of those states, whether you're working in Texas or California or New York or Florida. Right? Things are very different. There's something special right now about New York. In many of the places where we work, we're often in the position of sort of knocking on the door, promoting ideas and changes where we have to do a lot of convincing of the governors, the regulators, that what we're trying to get done here is going to make a lot of sense. In New York, that door has been thrown open. So the governor and the mayor here in New York has basically said to us, when I say us, I speak really in terms of the environmental community as a whole here, has said, okay, if you think we can really get this done, clear away the thicket of regulations that stands in the way of the technology that makes all this possible. Bring the private capital to the table to make the investments in efficiency or clean energy at the community scale. If you think it's possible, show us how. And that's the opportunity that we have now in New York, is that our top political leadership is actually saying to us, show us how to do this. And it's creating an opportunity for us that I think is deeply important. And I say this not just as a New Yorker, but I think it is one of the only places in the world where this is happening. I've been spending a lot of time the last few months traveling and thinking about our international energy strategy. There's a handful of places around the world where progress is really possible, really happening. Right? There's some parts of Germany, some parts of the UK, there's some cities in China. Right? And New York now is emerging as one of them. There are 3 sort of basic building blocks of what we, and in partnership with many of our colleagues in the environmental community and in business, are trying to get done here in New York. The first one is what is referred to is happening in the context of this thing called the Reforming Energy Vision Proceeding, right? Very sort of bureaucratic name, but it's quite revolutionary. The Public Service Commission in New York is the entity that sets the rules for the energy sector, that sort of determines how much solar, how much wind, how much geothermal, how much efficiency can we have, right? What do you pay Con Ed or National Grid to do? What do you want their business model to be, right? They've started this proceeding to invite the best ideas about what Cheryl has called Utility 2.0, sort of the future of how do you regulate, how do you write the rules of the game so that more clean energy can participate in the grid. You know, you can imagine when there's more solar power on people's roofs or more efficiency in the marketplace, if you're a utility whose business model is based on getting paid according to how much energy you're selling, right, that future doesn't look so good, right? You look at that and you say, well, if everybody's going to have solar and efficiency, what am I going to do, right? So we're not in the business to sort of rescue the utilities, but we are in the business to figure out what do we want to pay the utilities to do? What should their job be? How can they manage a network for a state as diverse as New York, right, from the southern tier to New York City to Long Island, so that we can begin to integrate renewables into that grid much more aggressively and ambitiously. So where those rules are being written now, and it's a 6 to 18 month process roughly now that is playing itself out. The second piece of that is making it actually happen on the ground. A lot of what we're talking about and proposing here is cutting edge, and it is new. You can't just go and write the rules and hope for the best. You have to get your hands dirty in communities and really see what it means to make it happen. I'll give you an example. In Brooklyn, central Brooklyn, there's a series of neighborhoods there that are gentrifying, where they have large public housing, where they have some new businesses starting up, including some tech businesses that use a lot of energy, a lot of electricity. So Con Ed, as the utility, is looking at that going, wow, load is growing in central Brooklyn. We need to do something about that. Their traditional way of doing something about that would be to say, great, we need to build more of what we built before, right? More traditional fossil fuel-based infrastructure to serve that need. In the context of this process, and with the backing of the governor and the mayor, Con Ed is now being asked, and we are now being asked, to provide an alternative. How could we meet that future load growth with distributed solar, with energy efficiency, with other technologies, with smart grid technology? Is there a way to do it cheaper and faster, right, that's more resilient in central Brooklyn with all the different stakeholders that you might have there? How do we engage all those folks and really make it happen? Making it happen there will help inform what the rules are that get written at the Public Service Commission. It's sort of an interactive process there. And the third piece of what we're looking at is what I think of as sort of political context. And it's sort of the squishiest one of all, in a way. But if you can imagine, as this process moves along, there are going to be some really big decisions that get teed up out of this process. If you want to change the business model that Con Ed operates under or National Grid operates under, at some point that decision lands on the governor's desk, right? And you can imagine the phone calls at 10 o'clock at night coming in saying, I think this is a good idea, I think it's a bad idea, right? And at that moment, sort of the decision moves sort of briefly away from, is this really good for the planet, right, into, is this really good for the governor? Is this really good for politics, right? And we need, and again, we, I mean our community, all of us, we need to have a voice at that moment in that room as well. And so EDF, we're rolling out a strategy here in New York that is trying to get the rules right, clear away that thicket of regulations that stands in the way of the business models of the future. We want to make it happen in a few places in New York City. And then we want to build that political context with really all of you so that when the decisions are happening, that our voice, that the environmental voice, the planet's voice, is right there in the room to help make that happen. Yeah.
Andy, isn't it a little bit more difficult in New York, though? Like in Ohio, PUCO has got more power since the utilities own generation. Since the New York utilities don't really own generation, it's a tougher play because Con Ed and Grid and NYSEG and Rochester don't really own meaningful generation. So there's less control, isn't there?
Actually, I think that's a really great point to raise, although the distinction is not between Ohio and New York. Ohio is also a restructured state.
But all the big utilities still own big generating fleets, whereas in New York, our guys don't own.
I'm sorry, you're talking about full corporations that happen in New York.
Yeah, exactly.
The utility is separate.
Yeah.
I think that the vestiges still exist, and it makes it more challenging when you're in a restructured environment, whether there's full corporate separation or not. And part of our strategies are to regulate, to recognize that the facts on the ground matter, so that we need to have different solutions in the vertically integrated states than we do in the restructured states.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of what needs to happen here, I think Cheryl sort of helped lay out these ideas about utility 2.0, about right, like changing the regulatory structure. What we're building is a central core of principles and ideas and sort of templates that can then be adapted into and translated into the different states and the different regulatory environments. And it won't be exactly the same in each state, but the animating principle, right? The idea that we want more clean energy in the grid, right? That we want access to capital to help folks upgrade their buildings, make them more efficient, and install technology. Those will animate what we do. Exactly how we will be different. Maybe you could just put that slide up of the world again, and then we'll open it up to questions broadly. I'm just bringing it back to this slide because as we started working on this in the U.S., we realized that, well, we sort of asked the question, where is this happening elsewhere in the world? Are there parts of the world that are ahead of us where we can be learning here? And we spent a lot of time I spent a lot of time in Europe, meeting with folks over there, Germany and UK and Spain, that have been struggling with many of these same challenges. As you see from our strategic plan, EDF has been active in China for over a dozen years, working on issues just like this one. It turns out that the issues that the New York REV proceeding is struggling with, these are the same issues that all these countries are struggling with in real time right now. And one thing I really learned was that, sure, some other places might be ahead on one piece or another piece, but we're ahead on some of it too. And in fact, in April, I have a whole delegation of European folks coming over here to learn about what are we doing in New York that's so special, because they're realizing, so Germany, for example, subsidized a tremendous amount of solar power into its electricity grid, and they did it without, and I'm being overly generalizing here, but they did it without bringing the grid along at the same time. And so they're finding that there are certain times a day when they have too much solar power on the grid, and they don't know what to do with it. They have to turn it off, right? Wind power too. They can't integrate it all into the grid, right? These are the issues that we want to get ahead of in the United States, and the states who are working and create the business models that we can then scale. With that, I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to questions. We already had some questions starting here in the room. I think what I'll do is I'll start here in the room, and then we'll move to phone and web, and we'll sort of have a little round robin that way. So questions in the room? Yes.
Do you see new players like Google and Apple coming in and becoming electric utilities using alternative energy?
Do you want to take that? I mean, the answer is probably, and I think our role is to create a regulatory framework in many places where that's possible, right? Where there is opportunity for new entrants like that to bring their ideas and their services to the table. I think that there's going to be a lot of interest, and we're seeing this already in the part of established utilities, to try to transition and play a more flexible sort of modern role. And I think the jury is out a little bit on who's going to win that or where they're going to win. I know here in New York, there's conversation, the work, the framework that gets talked about for Utility 2.0 is creating sort of a platform on which lots of different companies and technologies and innovators can plug in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we'd like to see really is the ability on a national and even global scale to think about how do we create sort of that competitive environment where the best business models and best ideas can come to the table and plug in and win.
I had thought that energy storage was a critical problem that we really hadn't quite mastered yet. Do you feel that a smarter grid can deal with those issues?
I think it can deal with them in part. I think if someone could really invent great storage, cheap, affordable storage, there's no question that would be a game changer, right? There's absolutely no question. And a lot of smart people are working on that, right? But I don't think we have to wait for that. And I'll just give you an example. If you look out the window, if we had windows here in this conference, and you could look out the window and you'd see all these buildings in New York City, right? Buildings that are using energy, right, all the time. Right now, those buildings, by and large, are dumb buildings, right? Electricity wire comes in, they use their electricity, it goes out, there's no communication there, right? It would be possible through systems that we call demand response systems to actually help those buildings vary their electricity usage by different times of day, by when there's more solar available in the market, by when wind is strongest. You can begin to shift demand back and forth to meet the cleanest supply. And you could do that by automating a lot of the systems that are currently built into our buildings and that are essentially the old school Thomas Edison generation kind of systems. So we could do a lot by building a flexible interactive grid that allows demand and supply both to vary. And so it wouldn't, I think ultimately, yes, it would be great to have really good storage, and I'm glad people are working on that because that would be a game changer. But I don't think we have to wait for it to get a long way down the road of where we want to go.
Yeah, definitely not. And there are additional studies and technologies. There are additional studies and technologies that are also helping us. We're now understanding now that we can get better predictive quality on wind so that we don't have to be so fluid with ramping. Same thing on solar. We're getting better technology so that we can predict in advance what we can expect so that we can make better use of the things that Andy's talking about with demand response, or even using some of the peaking plants that we have online already to balance the grid that's out there. So storage would be fabulous, and it's becoming increasingly affordable. We're seeing great advancements in storage, but we certainly don't have to wait. The technology that we need is available today to have a far, far cleaner future than we have right now.
And also, just on the storage question, we want the regulatory environment and the utilities that are out there, whatever entity, whether it's Google or an existing utility, we want those entities to be eager to adopt the storage technologies as they develop. So whatever we may think about how quickly storage will come and become commercially viable at scale, we need to have those business models in place so the minute it does in different places, we can get it right in there doing its job.
So our strategy is to make sure that we value the attribute. So it's not technology specific. What we say is if we need power at this location in this kind of time frame, then we want all comers to propose. How will that happen? Perhaps it's demand response, perhaps it's a fuel cell, perhaps it's storage, many, many other options that are out there. But what we do is we make the rules generic. We're moving to generic rules that say this is what's valuable to the grid at this point. Any taker, any technology that can provide it, it should be open to that technology to provide that service. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I have two questions. One has to do with nuclear power and the other to do with hydroelectric. Nuclear power is a sort of taboo subject that's politically incorrect. Andy mentioned being to Europe, but if you look at that map there, some of the brightest areas is France. France has a highly developed, government-controlled, safe nuclear power system, and then there's a whole new line of what's called fast breeder reactors, which gobble up most of their waste. So I'm not promoting it necessarily, I'm just asking what is EDF's position. And then on the hydroelectric side, I mean, here in New York State, we're blessed with abundance of hydroelectric electricity. I think we have 125 different generating systems. The largest, of course, is Niagara. But what about Quebec and Canada? Because they've built an enormous hydro generating capability. And is the United States benefiting from that? Is that fully exploited? Or what is the situation there?
I will take a shot at it. What I can tell you is that the focus of our program is actually at the distribution edge. So we haven't been working with, and we don't intend to work with, large-scale generation. What we see our role as being is making sure that at the distribution edge, we have a nimble enough platform so that those larger generation stations can be implemented or incorporated in a platform that's nimble enough to accept it. Andy, I don't know if you want to speak to larger, I mean, simply within our program, we're agnostic on the larger generation.
Right.
That's clean.
Right.
I do think one thing that EDF has been for years is technology neutral. We do focus on the end result
Of the air pollution and the climate pollution that's coming out. One of the issues with nuclear in this country, and we see it in lots of different countries, there are issues of cost that are very fundamental and that are very important to that question. Yes, you can have nuclear power plants. They are expensive. There are a lot of folks who I think raise legitimate questions about what do you do with the waste. I know France has some ideas and solutions, but it's very controversial. I think it's very hard to get full social buy-in into those. I mean, you know, if you go back to Europe for a minute, sure, this part of Europe is all about nuclear. This part is all about closing its nuclear plants, right? So I think the social issues and the cost issues are ones that are very difficult to work through. And if you were to put your eggs in that basket, it'd be a heck of a job to work through those. From our point of view, the opportunity out there now with many of the renewables that have been scaling up slowly over the years is such that we think we can get a lot of the way of where we want to go by clearing away the barriers now that stand in the way of those technologies. And so that's what we want to do. And I don't see the nuclear debate resolving itself fast enough to bend that curve on climate change. I do think that we can scale up these other technologies fast enough to do it if we really work on it. So I'm just going to hold questions here in the room for a minute, and I'll come back. But I want to switch to a web question. Please, yes.
Great, and if you are on the phone and you'd like to ask a question, just a quick reminder, you can hit the star key and then 1. And our first question is, you spoke earlier about private capital. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Sure. I want to give you an example of a project that we started actually here in the U.S. It grew out of a project, our Clean Heat project, that Mary over here in the corner led for many years at EDF. Our Clean Heat project in New York upgraded 4,000 buildings to cleaner heating fuels, and in the process it cut actual measured sulfur dioxide pollution in New York City 69%. Wow. It did that by deploying a mix of policy change and private capital at the same time. There was about $100 million available in private investment capital to help buildings make that transition. Out of that project, we really learned that you can accelerate energy efficiency upgrades much more quickly if you standardize how the process is done. Right now, a lot of buildings, when they're thinking about energy efficiency upgrades, each building kind of does it in a different way. Engineering is different. So if you're a banker or an investor, a hedge fund, an institutional investor, and you're looking at this market, you're saying, wow, I get it, this is really important, but boy, each of these little projects is small and it's different and there's a lot of them, and I don't want to work on that, I want to go work on something bigger. Right? So if we can figure out a way to aggregate, to standardize and aggregate those projects, we think we can create a better match between the energy efficiency opportunity in buildings and the large pools of private capital that exist, especially in the global capital markets. So we've launched something called the Investor Confidence Project that is designed to do exactly that. It is creating a standardized engineering framework across the United States for different classes of buildings, commercial, residential, and creating a sort of a seal of approval that says, if you do your project in this way, you get a stamp that says you're investor-ready energy efficiency. And we can begin to aggregate those and begin to invest in them at scale, just like we did in New York with our 4,000 buildings. That project launched in the United States, and last year we got a phone call from the European Commission saying, so we heard that you guys have solved this problem of standardization and aggregation in the efficiency market. Would you come over here and do it? Right? We said, well, we haven't exactly solved it yet, but we're sort of moving in that direction. And so they just gave us an investment of 2 million euros into a team of European organizations to work with us to replicate what we're doing in the U.S. and the private capital markets over in Europe. And so one day we hope to have this ability to have energy efficiency upgrade projects in buildings be pooled up and connected into capital really on a global scale. That's a few years away, but right now we're building the infrastructure to make that possible. So that's sort of an example of how we think private capital could play a much more transformative role in the market. But our job becomes helping to create the systems and the standardization so that capital can engage at the scale that it would like to and could. Yep, one more question from the web, and then we'll come back to the room.
Sure, this is from Dr. Alfred Bartlett. New York is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which includes several northeastern states, including Maryland, where I am from, and which is not exactly progressive in terms of energy production contributions to clean air. Do you foresee a structure mechanism to ripple the work in New York through the other regional mechanisms?
I think our short answer is yes. So RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, is, remember in the beginning I sort of talked about the pincer movement, like the price on carbon and the clearing away the thicket to make the good stuff less expensive. RGGI is a way to put a price on the pollution that comes out of power plants, and it's great, and it's a really essential to what we're doing. The cool thing about that approach is that it's happening here in the Northeast with RGGI. It's happening in California with AB 32, and in fact there are parts of Canada, and I'll come back to your Canada question. I forgot we didn't even answer your Canada question, sorry. But there are parts of Canada now that are looking to participate in California's carbon market. China has a number of pilot projects going in its cities trying to figure out how could China adopt a carbon market, right? So eventually it may be possible to begin to link up all that innovation, right, into a larger carbon market, which if we deploy it at the same time that we deploy what Cheryl has been talking about today in terms of the new utility business models, the role of private capital, that's going to create an unstoppable momentum, I think, toward clean energy, and makes me very excited. But Cheryl, do you want to add?
No, I agree entirely, and what I would also emphasize is that it's not the only mechanism for replication. One of the things that we've done to advance the clean energy work is we've assembled a team of folks who truly understand regulatory structures and have relationships with the regulatory commissioners across the country. They have the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and that organization meets 3 times a year, and ideas ripple and replicate across that organization very, very quickly. So we have been working strategically to meet with commissioners, to set up panel discussions, to plant seeds in those annual conversations about this, and to share information with individual commissioners so that they become champions to bring it to the larger body, and that's also a vehicle for replication of these ideas across the country. It's a very small community, and we have access to it, and it's a powerful way to spread the idea.
I'm curious, because this is, to me, one of the guts of the problems. Can you get there through NARUC, or is it going to be more effective to try to do it through the FERC? Because one of my frustrations is you look at interlocking state stuff, and the state, you've got a better, PUCO to me is more effective than the New York State Commission has been. But, if we had somebody like the FERC willing to do it at a national level, we get there quicker.
Thank you. So our program is designed on the power of those individual commissions. Those individual commissions are the ones that are regulating the distribution edge. the retail provision of electricity, the platform for delivery to the last end user. And while there are, 51 of them, if you count the District of Columbia, they're accessible and they're movable. As you said, you can get to the PUCO in Ohio. You can get to the individual commissioners. There are about 271 commissioners if you multiply them all out. And when you think about it, 271 people in this country have the possibility, they have the power, they have the ability to transform the electricity sector. That's doable. That's entirely doable. We do not have to take the FERC on, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's true that some of our lives can be easier if some of FERC's policies, like demand response, are upheld at the Supreme Court, where we're fighting very hard and collaborating with our partners to put a good case in front of the Supreme Court, hopefully to turn around that bad case. But the guts of our effort are at the commission level, and we're there, and it's a target that's very, very doable. We can do it.
I think that's right. I think FERC and the federal government in this case have roles on a few important pieces of it, and we're certainly fighting there. But what's sort of cool about this one is that the big decisions, some of the most important ones, are happening at that state level. And that creates a really interesting advocacy opportunity for us, because we can move forward with our advocacy almost without having to get caught up in the sort of inside the beltway political stuff. Right? We're convincing governors, we're convincing commissioners, we're working with utilities, we're working with the tech sector, working with the finance sector, right? Bringing them all together to craft something that works without having to get too caught up in some of the headline and posturing in Washington, which is great right now to not have to do that. Right? Any other questions in the room? Webb?
Sure, I just want to quickly remind everyone again on the phone, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can just hit the star key and then 1. We have a question from the web. Can you tell us any more specifics about your team's progress with REV? What do you have to do? What do you think about pricing?
You want to take pricing?
I'll take a shot at it. Sure. That's a very in the weeds question. So what we do very much, because we actually sit around for hours and brainstorm about how we can make this happen. So the REV proceeding is really about setting up a platform. The wholesale energy market operates on regional transmission organizations, and those are actually not-for-profits that just make the power flow across the transmission lines. In New York, the thought is, what if we had such a system for the distribution system? If it were a platform that just operated to allow all comers onto it without bias, as long as we could properly price them. So the challenge in New York, as you raised earlier, is the commission doesn't actually set pricing. It's a competitive environment. Consumers can shop. So how do we influence pricing inside of such an environment? And it's one of our most challenging issues. We're playing with a number of ideas that go past the first one is that the commissioners can set pricing for default pricing. I don't know how many of you actually shop for your electricity. If you don't shop, then what you get is the default supply. And the commission can set the price for that. So through the default supply, the commission can give market signals, give pricing signals. But the other thing that we're playing around with, and we're doing some studies and analysis around it, is what would happen if we simply unveil the prices? Because prices vary depending on where you pick up the electricity and what time you pick it up. What part on the net of the grid does it cost? What if we just disclose those prices? How will people respond to them? How will the market respond? Will Google and others come on and say, we'll be able to provide you with all the energy services that you need at your house for a flat rate per month? But for that, we'll take control of some of the cycling on your refrigerator, your freezer, your hot water tank. So the pricing is very intriguing in restructured states, and in large measure, it's probably going to be about unveiling those prices. Because what we know is that consumers respond. And we now have an Internet of Things that respond if we don't respond. I mean, consumers spend maybe 5 minutes a year thinking about electricity. Well, this Internet of Things is going to do it for us. It'll be set it and forget it. So it's drawing vendors in that will create these new apps for us. But to make that happen, we have to unveil the pricing.
Our team is actually doing a pilot project and designing a pilot project with Con Ed on this very question of pricing. We'll be focusing it largely on these parts of Brooklyn that I talked about earlier, or we're going to really try to design pricing systems so that not only, if you talk to economists will often say pricing is the answer, right? Pricing is the answer if the consumer sees it and can respond, right? So this question of marrying the technology with a varying pricing system, I think, is a real opportunity. We got to figure out how to do that. So we're going to jump into a few places here in New York and try it and practice it and make sure we get it right before we roll it out to everybody. Because if you change pricing and people don't see what that is, that can be kind of messy as well. There's a question on the phone.
We will go to Roger Liddell. Your line is open. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The question is on smart meters and the saturation that smart meters have to be to become effective smart meter dynamic pricing meters, which effectively don't exist in the residential sector in New York State. Is there a certain percentage saturation required to get most of the benefit out of dynamic pricing meters?
Thank you. That's a fabulous question. So where are we, just for context on smart meters in general? Approximately 40% of customers across the United States right now have what is called a smart meter, a meter that will give you that signal about what the price is at that time in that place on the grid. That's not true in New York. So going back to the 40% across the country, a huge part of our advocacy is to work with regulatory commissions and other stakeholders and advocates to say, listen, we made the investment. Let's do something more with this investment than eliminate meter reader jobs. Let's get value out of this information. Let's free it up and make sure that customers and entrepreneurs can get access to the information with the customer's permission so that new services can be developed. So in New York, which has not made a tremendous investment in smart meters, what would we have to see a response? Well, what I can point us to in general is that we know that even if something as small as like 3 to 5% of users respond to a price signal, we will clip a peak of energy. And by clipping a peak, we can ensure that fossil-fired generation is not required to meet needs as it varies, as energy needs go up and down. So I can't answer definitively what do we need for penetration on smart meters, but I can look at case studies that suggest you may not need everybody to respond to a price to get a large measure of the benefit of that nimble response to the grid. That's a great question.
Thank you. And Autopay on billing is a real problem. If one just has Autopay from your bank account, then there is no price signal being perceived.
That's absolutely true. A tremendous part of getting value for this information means having access to it. And people access information many different ways, whether it's going to show up on their phone and give them a text, whether it's a display panel in their homes, whether they don't need to respond to it at all, and they have a set and forget it type feature. But you're right, if you can't see it, you can't respond, or if something can't see it, you can't respond.
It's true. I get a text on my phone whenever my 14-year-old daughter's minutes plan exceeds the texting limit. So you can imagine there are all kinds of opportunities to use technology like this to get over this challenge. I think I saw a question over here. Yeah.
Yes. I wonder if you're aware about the negative effects of radiation from smart meters on health. This is a real problem I've been reading about. And do you know about this? Are you working with that? Are you looking for ways to try to, I mean, smart meters are a great idea, but not if it's going to really impact people's health.
I think that's a tremendous issue, and it's important to raise it. What we've done is we've tracked down every study that we could find, and the balance of the studies that we see and the compendium of them, the meta-analysis has demonstrated that there hasn't been significant, any demonstration of harm from the smart meters.
Well, I have read otherwise with some very specific stories about people having effects on their heart and, you know, other damaging effects depending on where the smart grids are in the building. But if they're in apartments that are closer to where the not smart grids, the smart meters are, you know, there's really quite an effect. Now, there may be some way to shield that. I'm sure there's some way to correct this problem, but...
Well, what we can do is package up the information, the best information that we have, and share it with you. And I'd love to get in a dialogue with you.
Where's the threat coming from? I mean, what is it in the meter that's dangerous?
You know, it's an interesting question. I mean, I carry this around with me in my pocket,
that doesn't
and it radiates. It has a field that goes around it, and I think it's a similar thing. It's an electronic device attached to your wall, right, that is occasionally communicating, right? So it's not that dissimilar from what a phone might do. I think one of the ways to address these kinds of concerns, and I think as EDF, as an organization, we're really trying to follow the science on this and see exactly where the science is leading us, and if we need more science on it, we'll be the first to call for it. But one approach, for example, is to offer consumers that don't want a smart meter to opt out, right? I think there's ways that, you know, if you know, a smart meter brings all kinds of advantages in terms of lower bills and lower pollution, and the pollution has tremendous impacts as well, so you got to balance all these things. I think if the consumer really doesn't want it, you know, that's fine. They shouldn't have to have it. Some folks don't want to have a phone. I have a dear friend who doesn't carry a cell phone. Fine, but you know, I can't call him.
But it's science. I mean, in the
key is
90s,
science.
we had all this stuff,
Right.
which was fake science about transmission lines, and it was
Yeah.
mostly debunked. And so then you get down to the basics, what's the better good? And I think from a health standpoint, the environmental remediation is going to have a better good than some theoretical.
But I think it is really important, and EDF, you know, we are a science-based organization. We are following the science. We don't see the issue as a concern really at the moment, but we are following it and tracking it.
And just to support the scientific basis for our program in general, I'd just like to share that with you because I'm really proud of this team. We have a number of economists on staff. We have a distribution engineer. I believe we're the only environmental NGO in the country that actually hired a former Con Ed distribution engineer to help us with the analysis for what we're doing. We have former regulators. We have former attorney who represented utilities working with us. So I'm really proud of the scientific basis and the knowledge basis that we've been able to assemble to help us with this advocacy.
I think, yep, question.
I just wondered about, since your goal here, as I understood it, is to develop a template here and then try to export that to areas that are in the dark. And one of the things that I've read about countries like India, for example, is that the small cadre of people in power also, in political power, also control the utilities.
Yeah.
And so, you know, all low-tech solar and things that would be natural are not actually happening to the detriment of the population at large. And so it seems to me like if you're going to have a loud party, you have to invite the neighbors. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you're giving a thought to how you're going to invite the neighbors so that, you know, the greedy people can make a buck also, and we can get this done.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can share, actually, just yesterday morning, I had a great conversation with the director of our China program. This is not my level of expertise, but what we try to do throughout EDF is partner up with people who do have that expertise. And she and I were talking about that exact question. The fact that if you're in a rural environment that does not have electricity at all, would you build the system that we have right now? Wouldn't you start from a different starting point? And those are the kinds of conversations that we help to inform each other with. I shared with her that one of the exciting things that we're looking at domestically is the integration of microgrids. the thought that a microgrid, and this was very successful in Princeton during Superstorm Sandy, it kept the lights on in Princeton. The microgrids can be designed to be highly efficient using combined heat and power, maybe natural gas fuel, maybe a little bit of storage, maybe some renewable, but packaged in a way that they can support what is in and around them. Now, if you take that concept and then you start putting microgrids next to each other so that they have bilateral agreements and relationships, then all of a sudden you've got a mini grid, and it may be a solution in a new rural area that takes it away from that centralized, that large central planning. And those are just the ideas. I mean, I by no means am an expert, and I won't pretend to be on international development of electricity, but what I can share with you is that EDF is committed to sharing what I know domestically with the folks who do know what's happening across the globe, and we're constantly sharing information between and among ourselves to make sure that we have the best information.
And I'll add to that, we have, I mean, I'll address, I won't answer fully your India question. It's a tremendously important challenge, and we don't have it all worked out yet. We do have on our team Richie Ahuya, who's one of the foremost experts on Indian politics, and also he comes out of the private sector in India. And he's really now trying to think through a lot of these issues for India. And what's exciting to me sort of on where we are in sort of the arc of history inside EDF in working through these issues is, we're going to start on our home base here in the U.S., right, and try to work through some of the really tough issues. And then as we go, we are going to be looking for those opportunities to partner both inside EDF with our China team, with our folks working in India. I was talking about a work we're starting up in Europe now, right, and begin to build those bridges so that where there's an opportunity to share information and to get an idea out there, we can get it going. But it is a tremendously, that is the global challenge. And I think the way I'm starting to look at it now is there's an opportunity in some of these places here to actually work through the problems now and then begin to build those partnerships with organizations or multilateral institutions to help spread them. But we are just trying to figure out how best to do that. We're not fully there yet on that piece of what we want to do.
We're now at 2 minutes after 2. I think maybe we should give you guys a chance to be released if you want to be.
So we're 2 minutes after 2, and I think we did promise 2 o'clock. So I'm going to officially say thank you all for coming, all of you here in the room, on the phone, and on the web. It's been great having this conversation with you. Cheryl and I are going to stick around a little bit, so especially if you're in the room, if you'd like to stick around and ask some more questions and talk some more, we're here for a bit. But I know you're all busy and places to go, so you're now officially